Hello, my name is Nancy Thomas Price.
And I'm Nicole Hall.
Today we're going to be talking about implications for instruction by connecting the Idaho Core Standards in Math and the Smarter Balanced Assessment. While this may be new and somewhat technical information, the feeling is that it's necessary to understand the big picture of the assessment system that will reflect the Idaho Core Standards in order to understand how instruction can be informed from this content. The Idaho Core Standards and assessments are all about what happens in the classroom. Smarter Balanced Consortium emphasizes a balanced assessment system consisting of formative, interim, and summative assessments that are designed to all inform instruction. The consortium's theory of action calls for full integration of the learning and assessment systems, leading to more informed decision-making and higher quality instruction, ultimately to increase numbers of students who are well prepared for college and careers. So today's learning targets. As a learner, you'll understand the specifics of the Smarter Balanced Assessment System. You will learn how the Smarter Balanced content specifications reflect the standards, assessment, and instruction. You'll understand ways to use the knowledge of the new assessment design, tools, and mathematics content to inform your classroom instruction. You'll learn how sample items and tasks can be used thoughtfully to elicit evidence about student understanding and teacher instruction. And you will understand some formative assessment strategies that can be used during instruction. How will one know that they've met those learning targets? These are the success criteria. You'll be able to show an understanding of the major components of the Smarter Balanced Assessment System and the vocabulary used in that system. That's a depth of knowledge 1 activity. I can specify the assessment claim, target, standard, and depth of knowledge for an item or task. That would be a depth of knowledge 2 for a skill target. And explain the response would be a depth of knowledge 3. I can use the concepts presented to design classroom instruction and assessments that elicit evidence of student learning. That's a reasoning and product target or depth of knowledge 3. And I can relate these concepts to other content areas at our grade levels. A product target, depth of knowledge 4. Let's just quickly go over depth of knowledge and understand what these different levels mean. Depth of knowledge 1, items require only verbatim recall or simple understanding of a word or phrase. So formative assessment would be simple understanding of a concept or a definition. Depth of knowledge 1 says that a student can recall or identify a fact, definition, term. The focus is on initial comprehension of content. Depth of knowledge 2 requires initial comprehension and subsequent processing. So students might need to paraphrase, summarize, infer, classify. Items may require application of concepts that are covered in depth of knowledge 1. So depth of knowledge 2 is really about demonstrating conceptual information through further explanation and interpretation, making some decisions about the content. Depth of knowledge 3 is strategic thinking, reasoning, planning, and using evidence to interpret, and requires deeper knowledge, requires explanations, again, generalizing, and connecting ideas that support thinking. Depth of knowledge 4, of course, is extending thinking and relating concepts to other content areas, new situations, synthesizing, and showing a new perspective. Before we begin, let's just have some shared understanding and clarify that a balanced assessment system includes formative processes, interim assessment, and summative assessment. The attributes of formative assessment are to clarify intended learning, elicit evidence, interpret that evidence, and then act on that evidence in a classroom situation. You can learn more about the components of a balanced assessment system by going to this link. Here's a definition for formative assessment. It is a deliberate process used by teachers and students during instruction, and it provides actionable feedback that's used to adjust the ongoing teaching and learning strategies to improve students' self-assessment, reflection, and attainment of learning targets and goals. Formative assessment can be planned and intentional or impromptu, but it's not graded, it's just for learning. Never more important than now, because teachers need feedback on their teaching, students need feedback on their learning. These are the 4 attributes of the formative assessment process. Clarify intended learning, eliciting evidence, interpret evidence, and act on evidence. Documents that we will be using in today's presentation: the Idaho Core Standards documents, Common Core 6 Standards, and this is a link to where those can be found on the State Department website. Smarter Balance math content specifications, currently still in draft form, and the item specifications, which are on the Smarter Balance website, and you can find them at the link provided. Cognitive Rigor Matrix article from Hess, Carlock, Jones, and Walkup, and Matrix. And there is also a link to find this document. All of these documents are also on our website listed under this presentation. And this PowerPoint is available there as well, as will be the recording of the webinar. Let's talk for a minute about content specifications. Content specifications that have been created by the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium are meant to create a bridge between standards, assessment, and instruction. The content specs organize the standards around major constructs and big ideas. They further describe what students should learn and be able to do to demonstrate evidence of their learning. We're going to be using Smarter Balance language, and the content specifications for both mathematics and ELA do 3 very specific things. There are different content specs documents for math than there are for ELA literacy. Those content specifications further outline implications for instruction, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Again, they organize the standards around the big ideas, and this can be seen through the claims, which we'll be discussing in a few slides. The content specs express what students should learn and be able to do, and they outline the evidence that is required of students in order to be successful on the Smarter Balanced assessment. That evidence you would want to also look for in your classroom. We're going to be starting with a conceptual framework that outlines how all of this fits together. If you turn to page 18 in the Mathematics Content Specification document, you'll see an overview of the content, claims, and evidence. Smarter Balance Content Specifications focus is on claims. A claim is a statement of what students know and can do based on the provided evidence, which is the content claim. We are saying that a student can do something because of the evidence that he or she produces. The interpretations of that evidence and where students are in their mastery is spelled out in the achievement level descriptors. Again, that conceptual framework has to do with evidence that are further spelled out in the assessment targets. Then the assessment targets align very specifically with content standards. Standard is the content to be learned, while the assessment target describes in greater detail the evidence will show that the content has been mastered and will show that students can do certain things with that content. Let's look at the relationship among content claims, categories, assessment targets, and standards. We did not provide the achievement level descriptor document, but this is, we'll want to reference it. This is from page 8 of that document. The Common Core State Standards are the focal point of a claim. Claims must be proven by evidence. The assessment targets map the standards into statements of evidence of what will be collected throughout the assessment to prove the claim. For math, assessment targets are derived from the content cluster headings or mathematical practices depending on the number of the claim. And we'll get more specific about that a little bit later. The standards are what the students know and are able to do. The assessment targets further describe how they take that content knowledge and do something with it. Content categories in math are the domains in the standards. And again, a claim is a broad assertion of the outcomes we expect to see from students if the Common Core State Standards are taught with consistency and the manner in which they're attended. So in a claim, we can say, this is true about a student if these standards can be demonstrated in this way, the assessment targets. The Smarter Balanced Assessment Summative Assessment is designed based on the principles of evidence-centered design. The assessment triangle is used to illustrate the fundamental concepts of ECD, which articulates the relationships among learning models, the cognition, assessment methods, the observation, and inferences one can draw from the observations made about what students truly know and are able to do. That's the interpretation. These three key elements should underlie any assessment system. Application of the assessment triangle contributes to better test design and can be used to gain insights into student learning. The assessment triangle was first presented by Pellegrino, Chudowski, and Glaser in Knowing What Students Know, 2001. The claims and rationale represent the cognition part of the assessment triangle. For each claim and rationale, there's a section in the content specifications that represent the observation corner of the triangle, where a narrative description lays out the kind of evidence that would be sufficient to support the claim. The evidence is the content categories, and more specifically, the assessment targets that are linked to the Common Core State Standards. Finally, the interpretation corner of the triangle is represented by a section for each claim that lists the proposed reporting categories that assessment will provide. This is still in draft form, and once the blueprints are finalized, the scoring specifics will also be finalized. Just a reminder that the achievement level descriptors further go into the interpretation of the evidence. And those are the proposed reporting categories. Those achievement level descriptors are used to explain the knowledge, skills, and processes that students will display at predetermined levels of achievement. Now's a good time to just check for understanding. Using the 6 choices that are on the screen, I'm going to make a statement. Make a little note to yourself about which of those statements relate to the following 6. What do we call the relationship among learning models, assessment methods, and inferences that can be drawn from the observations made about what students can truly know and do? If you wrote down evidence-centered design, you're right. What do we call what students know and are able to do, or the content? You're right. We call that the standards. What would be a process that's used during instruction to elicit evidence of student learning with intent to act on that evidence? If you said formative assessment, that's correct. Broad statements of the assessment system's learning outcomes are the assessment claims. And in the Idaho Core Standards for Math, the domain headings are the content categories, and that answer is not available in the list. What do we call the evidence that will show the content and application of knowledge has been mastered? If you set assessment targets, you're correct. I'm now going to hand this over to Nicole Hall, who will talk in greater detail about the content specifications for math.
All right, thank you, Nancy. So what we're going to do first is we're going to talk really quick about a quick review about the content standards and the mathematical practices. You should have watched our pre-webinar recording that went more in depth in the content standards and the mathematical practices, but for now we'll just review really quickly. So going back to Nancy's earlier, the graphic that Nancy had up as far as the relationship among content claims, content categories, assessment targets, and standards, I just want to point out again that the content standards and the mathematical practices are the focal point of the content claims. Now, if you're looking in the content standards document or the Common Core State Standards or the Idaho Core Standards, really briefly we'll just talk about how you would read the grade level standards. The standards are organized together in clusters, and just as a reminder, standards define what students should understand and be able to do. And as you can see again, related standards are grouped together in a cluster. And above the cluster, you'll see a main standard or the cluster heading that the specific standards fall under. The cluster heading conveys the larger intent of a group or cluster of standards. And then right above that, you'll see the domain heading, which signifies a larger group of related standards or cluster headings. So under one domain, you're going to have several cluster headings with the cluster of standards underneath each cluster heading. Again, briefly, we will go over the standards for mathematical practices. And again, we went more in depth in the pre-webinar recording. If you look at this graphic, William McCollum out of the University of Arizona developed this graphic, and what he's done is he's grouped the mathematical practices into groups, related groups. So if you look at the vertical gray bar, you're going to see mathematical practice 1 and 6, and their overarching habits of mind of a productive mathematical thinker. And then he groups mathematical practice 2 and 3 in a reasoning and explaining group, and 4 and 5 in modeling and using tools, and 7 and 8 in seeing structure and generalizing. And something important to remember is that with the mathematical practices, they're the same across all grade levels, and what they're not talking about what the teacher does, but rather the different levels of expertise that educators should seek to develop in their students, and they're really how the students are expected to engage in the items or tasks. So moving on, we're going to talk about the mathematics assessment claims. And just keep the terms we just reviewed in mind as we go through the content specifications. The content specifications will relate directly back to cluster headings, domain standards, and mathematical practices. So going back to our graphic, as we go through the content specifications, it actually goes in the reverse order. While the standards are the focus, the content specifications talks about the content claim first and then moves on to the content category and the assessment target. And from there you'll see the relationship from the assessment target to the standard itself. So for math, as Nancy said earlier, the math claims are different for ELA and for math, but the 4 claims under mathematics, claim 1 is concepts and procedures. Claim 2 is problem solving, so where students are making productive use of knowledge and problem-solving strategies. Claim 3 is communicating reasoning, where their student would be working on constructing viable arguments to support their own reasoning and to critique the reasoning of others when solving mathematical problems. And claim 4, modeling and data analysis. So they're analyzing complex real-world scenarios and constructing and using mathematical models to interpret and solve problems. So as you're looking at this, what you'll notice right away with claim 1, concepts and procedures, since the student is explaining and applying mathematical concepts and interpreting and carrying out mathematical procedures, this is more of the content, the bare bones type problem or item, and then claims 2, 3, and 4 focus more on the mathematical practices. So while claim 1 does focus primarily on the procedural knowledge, you can see mathematical practices 5, 6, 7, and 8 relate directly back to that. You want to attend to precision when you're solving problems of this nature. You're going to want to model and use tools, and you're definitely going to have to, the student is going to have to see structure and generalize in solving problems that align to claim 1. Claim 2, again, just as a reminder, as Nancy said, the content specifications were developed for item developers. So when they're developing a problem that aligns to this claim, they have to keep in mind what claim 2 is even talking about. So claim 2, problem solving, you'll see that mathematical practices 1, 5, and 8 align directly to it, where a student would need to make sense of a problem and persevere in solving the problem. And not only that, they would need to use appropriate tools, and they, again, need to see structure and generalize when solving the problem. For claim 3, communicating reasoning, the item that would be developed would need to require the student to attend to precision, mathematical practice number 6. And mathematical practice number 3 is very important in that mathematical practice number 3 requires a student to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. So an item aligned to claim 3, a student would have to communicate their reasoning as part of answering the problem. And claim 4, modeling and data analysis, mathematical practices 2, 4, and 5 are directly related to this claim. There has to, a student would need to reason abstractly and quantitatively when solving a problem of this type, and also they would have to model with mathematics and use the appropriate tools strategically. So then as we went through these claims, you may ask yourself, can a task or assessment item be aligned to more than one claim? Well, if you answered yes, you are correct, and on the screen right now is a piece out of Principles and Standards for School Mathematics by CCM. And just keep in mind, mathematics is not a collection of separate strands or standards. Though it is often partitioned and presented in this manner, rather, mathematics is an integrated field of study. Viewing mathematics as a whole highlights the need for studying and thinking about the connections within the discipline as reflected both within the curriculum of a particular grade and between grade levels. So through these 4 claims that we just looked at, keep in mind the content is throughout each of the claims, but also the mathematical practices needed to be employed as well. So when you start thinking about the items and how they align to the claims, what is also going to fall into play is the item types. So for claim 1, since it's more procedural, you're going to see more selected response type items that align to claim 1. And keep in mind, this isn't the regular multiple choice that we have seen in the past. Selected response is very different with the Smarter Balance system, and we'll see more of that as we move on. Constructed response is, you'll see as you go into claim 2, 3, and 4, you'll see items that are more constructed response, extended response, performance task, and technology enhanced is throughout all of these item types. So we're going to do a little bit of claim alignment practice, and you should have downloaded off of our website the activity sheet that went with this, and it was a progressive activity. And the very first item that's in that progressive activity is a grade 7 item. There's 2 parts to it, and there's several statements in part A, and you're going to, what a student would do is they would read through these statements and they would answer, is it always true, is it sometimes true, or never true? And I only have one of the statements up here, but there's like 4 or 5 on your sheet. Part B, then, the student would go on and they would be asked, okay, for those statements that you chose, sometimes true, now you need to go back and give some examples of why this is so. So when we think about this, let's go back to the claims, claim 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which claim does this item align to? Is it claim 1, concepts and procedures, claim 2, problem solving, claim 3, communicating reasoning, or claim 4, modeling and data analysis? So what I would do right now is just stop the recording, think about that, and then when you're ready for the answer, go ahead and start the recording again. So what claim does this item align to? If you decided that it aligned to claim 3, you're correct. Again, keeping in mind that you need to look at both part A and part B. And then there is a secondary claim. It's claim 1. And so, as you can see, not only would the student have to communicate reasoning in part B, part A is strictly concepts and procedures. It's very basic procedural knowledge to answer whether or not the statement is always true, sometimes true, or never true. Looking at a second item, this is a 3rd grade level, and it will be the second one on the activity sheet that you have. What a student would have to do in solving this is there are 2 rectangles joined together. They're going to have to find the total square feet combined for those 2 rectangles. And this is one of these selected response items where there's multiple parts to it. So then they would have to go on, and for A, they get another rectangular figure. It's 4 feet by 6 feet, and they'd have to find out the square feet for that, the area, the square footage, and then they would combine that with the original 2 rectangles they had, and they would have to decide, okay, now with all 3 together, does the total exactly equal 99 square feet? And they would indicate yes or no. And they would have to go on to each subsequent shape and do the same thing, going back to the original 2, adding the 3rd to the original 2 to see if it equals exactly 99 square feet. And I only have 3 additional rectangular shapes. I believe there were a total of 5. So, based on your knowledge of the claims, which claim does this item align to? Go ahead and stop the recording think about it, maybe look back at the claims if you need to, and decide, and then we'll go over to need to. So what claim does this item align to? It aligns to claim 1. This is very procedural. And remember, this is the summative assessment. So at the end of 3rd grade, while this problem, if it was presented to a student in the middle of 3rd grade, might be more of a problem-solving type item, especially dependent on how the teacher chose to present it to the students and how the students responded and if they needed to explain their reasoning. But at the end of 3rd grade, this would be very procedural. They would just get down to the mathematics, apply the area formula, and complete the mathematics and be done. So is there a secondary claim? There is not. And what you'll find as you start looking at the Smarter Balance items, if the problem aligns to claim 1, there usually is no secondary claim. Because claim 1, again, is that procedural knowledge. And then if you have claim 2, 3, or 4, it's more directly linked to the mathematical practices. So not only would you be doing like an extended response where you would be explaining your reasoning or problem solving or modeling, obviously the mathematics and the procedural knowledge is intertwined with that. So then you would have the secondary claim of claim 1 if your primary claim was claim 2, 3, or 4. So moving right along, we said we'd talk about the content claims first, and then we'd go on to the content categories and the assessment targets. So for the assessment targets, well, as Nancy said earlier, the content categories are the math domains in the content standards. The assessment targets are directly derived from the standards. So for claim 1, they're those cluster headings. They're not the specific standards underneath the cluster heading. They are the cluster heading verbatim, and this is for math. And for claims 2, 3, and 4, they are derived from the mathematical practices. They're not verbatim from the mathematical practices, but you can see how they relate as we start looking at the assessment targets under claim 2, 3, and 4. So if you turn to page 30 in your content specifications, where we are at the 3rd grade, and again, this is claim 1, and so there are specific assessment targets for each grade level that will be tested on the summative assessment. So there will be for grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. But we're just going to look at grade 3 because it's going to be the same across the grade levels. So on page 30, for each claim there are a series of assessment targets. And again, as Nancy said, they provide the educator with a description of the evidence required of students to score proficient on the Smarter Balance assessment. So claim 1 assessment targets are directly related to the Common Core content standards, and they're based on the standards for each grade level. So what you'll see first is that the assessment targets are grouped by content category, and the content categories are the mathematic domains found in the content standards. So operations and algebraic thinking is not only the first content category under grade 3, if you turn to the content standards, it's also the first domain in grade 3. And then directly under that, you'll see the assessment target, represent and solve problems involving multiplication and division. While it's target A, the first assessment target under the content category, operations and algebraic thinking, the same thing will occur in the content standards. This will be the first cluster heading under the domain operations and algebraic thinking. And then you will notice that there's either an M or an A/S, and M, it means that this will be a major assessment target. And if you have A/S, it means it will be an additional or supplemental assessment target that will tie in with one of the major assessment targets. You'll see the depth of knowledge that an item will require a student that centers around this assessment target. And then you'll see the description of evidence, which is taken directly from the specific standards underneath that cluster heading in the content standards. So if you look side by side, hopefully you have both these documents with you. You turn to page 23 in the Common Core State Standards, and you have this page 30 still open in the content specification. You'll see what we just talked about. The first domain under grade 3 is the first content category in the content specifications. And the first cluster heading will be target A, the first target assessment target in the content specifications. And then the evidence, if you look directly back to that cluster of standards under the cluster headings, you'll see how it relates, that the standards or the primary focus and they were used to derive that evidence. Then as you continue on, the pattern just repeats itself with the second cluster heading as the second target underneath that content category. So very briefly, Nancy and I, what we did for Claim 1 for Grade 3 is we worked backwards and we took all the standards or the cluster headings from Grade 3, which are to the right of this graphic, and then we went ahead and tied it back to each assessment target. And then from there to each content category or domain, and then back to Claim 1. So if you look, we just took a portion of this larger graphic. We just took the top target, target A, and we showed you how all these 3 cluster headings directly relate back to assessment target A. And keep in mind, it's not always this simple. What you will have sometimes is a cluster heading from a different target, not only being a major content for one target, but it may also be a supplemental content for another target. So it may align to 2 or more. For claims 2, 3, and 4, again, we're looking primarily at the mathematical practices. What you will see is, again, they align to the mathematical practices. You go back to the mathematical practices, read through them, and you'll see how they relate. Depth of knowledge is also included. If an item for target A is created, it should require a student to work on the depth of knowledge of 2 or 3. And then a description of the engagement. How is the student expected to engage in the mathematical practices with an item aligned to this assessment? And then there is another section, relevant verbs, and what this is telling you is that under claims 2, 3, and 4, I just put it in a nice little table. And what it's telling you, if you went back to the content standards and it had one of these verbs within the cluster heading, then items will be created that also align to these claim 2, 3, or 4. Not just the content under claim 1, but also you have to talk about how students will be engaged in the mathematical practices as well. The nice thing is, though, is that Smarter Balance has done this for us. Right now, currently, they do not have it up online, but we're still in the draft form. They're making final adjustments to it, and it should be up soon. So you can go straight to Claim 2. You can go down to the grade level you teach, and you'll know which specific cluster headings in the content standards will also be tied to assessment targets under Claim 2. Not only the content, but the mathematical practices that you'll find under Claim 2, problem solving. And then the same for Claim 3 will apply, and for Claim 4. So we're going to do a quick assessment target practice. We're going to go back to that progressive activity that we had earlier when we were aligning to claims. And we're going to relook at this and decide, okay, this is a grade 7 item. What are the assessment targets? Go into your content specifications, go to grade 7, and go through the content categories and find the assessment targets that directly align to this problem. We would want to go back and look through the evidence and say, okay, this problem is requiring this evidence of my students. So which assessment target does it align to? Go ahead and pause this recording, and then we will go over the assessment target that aligns to this item. So the assessment targets that align to the 7th grade item are claim 3, that's the 3B. So it's claim 3 assessment target B, claim 3 assessment target F, because if you remember when we aligned to the claim, we said that the primary claim that this problem aligned to was claim 3. So then you go back, you look at claim 3, and you look at the assessment targets directly under claim 3 to see further alignment. But there was not only a primary claim, there was also a secondary claim under claim 1. And if you go back and look under claim 1, you will see that assessment target F directly relates back to this item. And going on to our 3rd grade problem, we're going to do the same thing. Think back, which claim did this align to? And go back to that claim. If it's claim 1, go back to the 3rd grade level. If we had decided that it aligned to claim 2, 3, or 4, you would just go to that claim and decide which assessment target aligns to it. So go ahead and stop the recording. Go back to the claim that we agreed aligned to this item, and then find the assessment target. So when we aligned a claim to this item earlier, the primary claim was claim 1, and then if you went back to claim 1 under the 3rd grade, you would discover that assessment target I is the correct assessment target for this item. We didn't have a primary claim, so we don't need to worry about that. So the question is, okay, we're getting a little bit better understanding of the content specifications and how the standards are the focus of the content specifications and the focus of the item developers who develop items for the summative assessment. But how is this important to our teaching? What are the implications for instruction? So you kind of look back over that. Keep in mind, as far as the claims and assessment targets, the claims are the statements about what we claim students can do if we see the specified evidence, and the assessment targets are statements that describe the evidence of how proficiency on the content standards will be assessed. So how's that important to our classroom practice? Well, what I would do is you would want to go back to your classroom lessons or your units, and you'd want to identify the Idaho content standards and cluster headings that align to that. And then from there you will have to ask yourself, okay, do you think that the lesson do you feel that it aligns to the identified standards and the cluster headings? And if so, then go to the content specifications, find the corresponding assessment targets and claims. And then from there, ask yourself, what will the evidence of a proficient student look like? So if a proficient student was actually completing the lesson or assignment which you had given, what would proficiency look like? And then check and see if the content specifications agree with what you have determined proficiency will look like. So going back to that assessment target, does the evidence descriptor from the assessment target match to what you're thinking? And if it's not, then you can say, okay, how can I change this lesson? How can I change this unit so that the evidence I get from my students is identical to that of the assessment target and the content specifications. So what I'm going to do now is Nancy's going to talk further about depth of knowledge and how it relates to the content specifications.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. So this is a content rigor matrix, and it's more of a generic one. If you turn to pages 92 and 93 in the math content specifications, you'll find a snapshot of the cognitive rigor matrix. And it's the same one that's displayed on this slide. This was developed by Karen Hess, who's a senior associate with the National Center for Assessment, and several of her colleagues. People, Karen Hess, she has a lot of really good things out there about depth of knowledge, and specifically for different content areas. The Common Core State Standards really require a high-level cognitive demand, and that's something that really has been a shift with these new standards. Students are really asked to demonstrate deeper conceptual understanding through the application of content knowledge and even skills to new situations and sustained tasks. Tasks and situations in which there may not be a correct answer. So for each assessment target in the content specifications, the depth of knowledge, which we call DOK for short, requires that it describes that students need to bring, what students need to bring to an item or task that has been identified. And so that's spelled out here, or some suggestions of it. The matrix draws widely from two accepted measures that describe cognitive rigor. One is Bloom's taxonomy, which you see in the left-hand column, and the other is Webb's depth of knowledge, which is along the top. So the cognitive rigor matrix has been developed to align these two models as a strategy for analyzing instruction, for further influencing teacher lesson planning, and for designing high-level cognitive assessment items and tasks. There is also a different cognitive rigor matrix in the content specifications for the ELA literacy, and that really focuses on processes that students will use in the cognitive demand for the ELA content. So more detailed information is in that Hess article that was mentioned at the beginning of this PowerPoint, and that that article is available for you to download. The following video gives a brief 2-minute overview of the cognitive rigor map. So you can take a look at this. And I'm just going to make it full screen.
When I heard the phrase Webb's depth of knowledge, I didn't even know it was a guy. I thought it was like webbing or norming. Bloom is focusing on the type of thinking. Are you analyzing? Are you comprehending? Are you evaluating? Webb said, how deeply do you have to know the content to be successful? DOK is not about difficulty, it's about complexity. So you have to say, what kind of mental processing would have to occur? So his level 1 is the ability to recall things, to remember things. And you could memorize something pretty simple, or you could memorize something pretty complex, but it still would be memorizing. Depth of knowledge 2 is basic application and skills. You might be organizing information. Usually what sets DOK 1 apart from DOK 2 is you're acting on the information in some way. It's a little bit more complex to do that because you have to understand relationships between pieces of information. For DOK1 and DOK2, there's usually a right answer. Whereas when we get up to the higher thinking, it's more about strategically thinking through the content and maybe reasoning it out to get to what some meaning might be. And there might not be one right answer, but multiple ways to get to the right answer, multiple possible right answers. When you get to DOK3, that's usually when you have to use reasoning to answer the question. You might have to be planning a strategy. How are you going to approach the problem? It's usually non-routine. It's a question maybe I haven't been asked before. So I'm drawing on prior knowledge, making text-to-world, text-to-text kinds of connections. Extended thinking usually is, I've got to do a research paper. I've got to read multiple texts, synthesize information, decide what's important, put it together in maybe a unique way, a world presentation or PowerPoint. And there's just a little example here of describing the most significant effect of World War II on the nations of Europe. You would have to go deeply into many different concepts. I would have to know World War II, I would have to know effects, I would have to decide what makes it a significant effect, and I would have to look at different nations. So that immediately is bumping it up, actually to a DOK4.
Okay, and I apologize if it was a little bit low in terms of the volume on my end, if it wasn't high enough for you to hear that. Again, this link is listed in the PowerPoint, so you can go back and listen to that on your own. So following along with our activity, which by the way is a DOK2 activity. For these activities, we do have a right or wrong answer, as Karen has said. So we're now going to look at the depth of knowledge for this progressive activity. So I want you to take a look at that 7th grade item and try to determine what type of thinking that students would have to use to solve this problem. There are 2 parts. What are they being asked to do there? And so you're right, it's strategic thinking and reasoning. And the reason that they have tagged this as a DOK3 is mostly due to part B in that question. That for each statement they choose, sometimes true, they should provide one example, and there may be multiple correct answers for this particular problem in the way that students describe this. And then we can go back as well and look at Bloom's. What type of thinking? What cognitive process? Okay, we're going to take a look at the 3rd grade item. And while you're looking at these, another discussion that you might have with your team or the group in which you're going through this is what could you do to modify any of these tasks to be at a different depth of knowledge? I think that would help people engage in the content. So what depth of thinking for the 3rd grade item? And if you selected DOK2, you're correct. This has to do with basic skills and concepts. And you can have a discussion with your team as to why you feel that's true. And the type of thinking from Bloom's, when we did this live, we identified several and had a good discussion about that. So that's a further activity that you can do with your team. Now we're going to see an example of how the content specifications can aid educators in creating or extending existing lesson plans to meet the rigor of Common Core. Common Core does not require, the Untitled Core standards does not require that we throw everything out and start over. You can always take your existing assessments, your existing instructional practices, your existing lesson plans and modify them to include some of the things that we've talked about today. So what are the implications for instruction? Remember that the cognitive rigor matrix requires that you understand how blooms and webs are alike and yet different. It also helps you examine the DOK required for different tasks. And again, depth of knowledge is not something that we just talk about in regards to assessment. It relates to any type of classroom activity or task that you might do. Cognitive rigor matrix allows us to categorize selected and assignments and learning activities, and to apply test design and to apply this information to test design and the item development process. So taking a look at your classroom lesson, pull out a classroom lesson, identify the Idaho content standards and cluster headings that would align with your existing lesson. And then, do you have a lesson that you feel aligns to those identified standards and cluster headings already? So if so, go to the content specifications and find the corresponding assessment target. From there, take a look at the classroom tasks that you have included in that lesson. What will the evidence of a proficient student look like? In the content specifications, you can see if the evidence descriptor from the assessment target matches your lesson, and then just make adjustments if needed. And then for your classroom task, what is the cognitive process and the demand required of students to be able to complete that task? Take a look at the cognitive rigor matrix and identify the depth of knowledge aligned to the task and make adjustments if needed. Again, this does require a little bit of time, but should not be more than 10 minutes. And once people become familiar with content specifications, depth of knowledge, assessment claims, and making sure that you've got that alignment, looking at things through the lens of the assessment can help improve the instruction to further relate to the new standards. Let's take a little closer look at the item specifications and the tasks. For every item that is written for either the summative assessment or the interim assessment, an item specification tag or matrix or chart that is required. So any vendor, anybody that's actually supplying an item, our Idaho item writers, they're required to align all of this information to every single item that they write for the test. The most important thing is to really know how to decipher the item specifications for any given item. A good portion of the item specification can be easily interpreted because they're labeled. However, we'll just briefly go over the item specifications and how they're laid out for each item type through this PowerPoint. Then we'll be looking at a selected response item. The first section is the ID, and there are some very specific things in every ID. And then it gets to the claims. Remember that the claims are broad statements of the assessment system's learning outcomes. Each of those requires evidence that articulates the type of data and/or observations that will support an interpretation of competence towards the achievement claims. Sometimes there's one claim. In many cases, two claims are being addressed. Assessment targets. Again, sometimes there's one that corresponds to an item, and sometimes an item has two assessment targets aligned to it. Remember that the assessment targets are cluster level headings in the math standards, and they're used in order to allow for the creation and use of tasks that require proficiency in a broad range of content and practices. Use of more fine-grained descriptions would risk a tendency to atomize the content, which might lead to assessments that would not meet the intent of the standards. So just assessing tiny little pieces is not the goal. Then we get to the domains. Remember, the domains in the Common Core State Standards in Math are the larger groups of related standards, content domains. The standards are given. Again, sometimes there's one standard that relates to an item, and sometimes there are multiple standards. We look at the mathematical practice standards, and those describe the varieties of expertise that mathematics educators at all levels should seek to develop in their students. This one happens to be regarding mathematical practices 1 and 2. And the item type. SR is selected response. Depth of knowledge, I skipped that. The cognitive rigor that a student needs to bring to the item or task as determined by the cognitive rigor matrix in order to complete the task successfully. Remember that selected response is not simple multiple choice often. It includes computer-enhanced items. Distractors are chosen very intentionally to embody common misconceptions so that when students select the incorrect answer, it tells us something very specific about where their understanding is, and they're designed to make sure that students do not obtain correct answers because of guessing or test-taking skills. And then the range of difficulty. Until the field test occurs, that's just an estimation. So they're going to be getting a lot of information about item difficulty after we go to the field test this spring. And then, of course, the key is the correct answer. Now you're going to try it. Select one or more items with the attached blank answer sheet. And in your teacher team, you're going to use the content specifications document to determine the item specifications. So we're basically going to work backwards. And then there are answer keys provided to check your answer when finished. So you're going to take this activity and stop the recording. You're going to work as a team and determine the critical specifications for each item. Again, this is an activity that just allows you to further engage in the content so that you can internalize some of these concepts. And this is a big shift for us. Once those concepts are internalized, this will go much faster. In a follow-up recording, we take you through resources that are available on different websites, from the State Department website to the different mathematics websites to the Smarter Balance websites, and we go over specifically different areas that allow you to get further information about where the information from today's recording was obtained. Okay, so that is all for today, and we will, again, be glad to take any questions that you might have. Again, we did this, the navigation of the Smarter Balance site on another more detailed recording. So by the end of these different recordings, again, this is the third in a series of 4 recordings. And when we did this workshop live, it was a good half-day workshop, so you can understand why we've broken it into several pieces. Hopefully you understand the specifics now of the Smarter Balanced Assessment System, or at least are moving towards that understanding. Should be able to see how the Smarter Balanced content specifications reflect standards, assessment, and instruction, and I've gained some further insight into ways to use the knowledge about this assessment design, tools provided, and the mathematics content to inform classroom instruction. Don't throw everything out, just take what you're doing now and modify it. and to understand how sample items and tasks can be used thoughtfully to elicit evidence about student understanding and teacher instruction. Throughout the live workshop, we use various formative assessment strategies that could be used during instruction, like the progressive task we did today. And again, the success criteria. So what are the next steps? Become more familiar with the content and all of the documents discussed today. Begin using those documents and identified implications for instruction when adjusting current activities, lessons, or units to meet the rigor of the Idaho content standards. And make sure you have balance. Visit the websites provided on Recording 4 and view sample lessons and plans that are aligned to formative assessment activities. And then complete the post-webinar recording and the associated activity for that recording. This presentation can be found on the following website: and I'm not sure that at this time the SurveyMonkey is still available. But your feedback is always greatly appreciated and is used to make adjustments in future training. So if you have feedback for us, feel free to contact Nicole or myself, and we'll be glad to take your comments, questions, or suggestions. Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you in the field.